Hello, everyone. It's midday, Tuesday, 12th of November. Thanks for joining us for the November ALA webinar. My name is Martin Westgate. I lead the Science and Decision Support team here at the ALA. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're calling from today, and all our speakers today on the same bit of country today, which is a nice change, which are the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay our respects to elders past and present. Today's webinar is a little different for us. Very often in these series, for those of you who tuned in before will notice already that we try and promote a range of organisations, a range of partners, and today is a bit more about a collaboration that we're actually part of, which makes a nice change in several ways. The ALA is Australia's biodiversity database, but it's also a website, and trying to find a way to share the huge amount of information that's stored in the ALA and comparable organisations like GBIF or the other living atlases is actually a really huge problem. And so today we want to talk about a partnership that we've had with Professors Whitelaw and Adrian Mackenzie, who are also on the call, and we'll be giving a presentation today about how to share biodiversity information with people in as clear but also an evocative way as possible. So without further ado, I might hand over to Mitchell to give the presentation, if that's all right.
Thanks so much, Martin. Yeah, it's so good to be here, and it's great to be able to share some of this work and in a way launch some stuff that we've been working on for quite a while. So I'm going to share my screen. I've got a few slides and some live demos today. So today Adrian and I wanted to talk about the work that we've been doing through this idea of generous interfaces for discovering biodiversity data. And so we're going to zip through some ideas, introducing what do we mean by generous interfaces, tell you a bit about the project, what we've been up to, show some of the research parts of the project. So we did quite a lot of research with users of ALA data and interfaces, and then show you some of the outcomes. And we're going to try and leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So I'll introduce Adrian in a sec, but I just wanted to start with this idea about generous interfaces. So I've been working in this kind of stuff for a while in my research, and I wanted to explain this concept. So when we say generous interfaces, what do we mean? One way of thinking about it is, for a lot of information systems like databases or other kinds of what you might call digital collections, we still use search as the predominant interface, but search has some kind of slightly undesirable characteristics at times. It kind of withholds information. It's not very good at telling you what a collection contains. And it also requires that you give it a query. So, the only way of finding out what's behind a search box is to try a search. So I call that a kind of like an ungenerous approach to collections, because it's basically holding a lot of stuff back. So really the question is, how can we be more generous in providing access to the information that's in these collections? And basically the idea of generous interfaces suggests a few ways of doing that. And pretty much it says these collections should be browsable. You should be able to explore them. In other words, you should be able to kind of wander around and find things, investigate things and discover things in a collection. These digital collections can show overviews, so they can show high-level kind of summaries or condensed visualizations of what they contain. And they should also reveal relationships between things in the collections. So basically it's about how can we open up these collections to get them kind of out from behind the search box and show them in ways that are a little bit richer. And for a while I've been working with cultural collections, so things like museum or art gallery collections. There are some examples in the background of that slide. But in this project, we applied some of those principles to working with biodiversity data, which, has been incredibly fun. And so it's been an awesome project. So that's a little bit about generous interfaces. In terms of the project as a whole, the idea, what we're doing here is really investigating kind of alternative approaches to showing and interacting with biodiversity data. So if you've used ALA or have used other things like GBIF or other citizen science platforms, you'd be familiar with the kinds of interfaces that we have for exploring biodiversity data. You might even have some opinions about the merits of those different interfaces. This project is really about redesigning interfaces, thinking about different ways of doing things, exploring the possibilities of getting beyond kind of the usual or conventional ways of showing this material. And to do that, very briefly, what we've done is a kind of a research process where we did some initial explorations in the form of these things that we call data stories. We did some social research around that, talked to some people, got some really interesting results, developed some designs, and then documented them. And I'm going to show you some of the outcomes of that today. First of all, what do we mean by this idea of a data story? Basically, it's a kind of a narrative or storytelling form which combines visualizations and other kinds of structured information. It basically gives us a way to methodically explore a bunch of material in a way that is also exploratory for the user so that they can investigate material, in that kind of context. I'll show you some examples of that in a sec. So as part of the site that I'm going to be demoing today, which is now available on the ALA site, on the ALA's Labs channel, we show some kind of polished versions of these data stories, but we use the data stories really as a research tool. So we use them as ways for users to investigate, think about. We ask them questions about what it was that they were seeing. But you can investigate the data stories yourself and have a play. And I'm just going to show a couple of examples from the data stories now. So this first one is from a data story called Digging into Data, which is really about the ALA's data from the point of view of data resources or kind of where data comes from, really. So looking at the data resources as the source of the ALA's data. And this visualization, data resources over time, is kind of a fun and new way of looking at data resources. ALA has thousands of data resources, so it's quite a long list. Like, it's quite hard to navigate. But this is a simple list which is filterable and also includes a time-based visualization. So it's basically a way of showing you where in time do the records from a particular data resource come from. So, for example, if we're looking at here we're looking at frog-related data resources. So you might be familiar with Frog ID, and you can see there's this bright block that starts around 2016 or so, and is generating masses and masses of observations. And so that's probably not very surprising. If you're familiar with other kinds of platforms, you might notice something, for example, like eBird. You see this similar pattern where eBird's generating tons and tons of resources in very recent years. But there's also a lot of other resources that are bird related that have different kinds of patterns. So this is a way of kind of investigating what data resources exist and also how they behave over time, which shows you some really interesting and different things. So, for example, here's some kind of Queensland related resources. You can see there are some things that only have records in a single year or two, others that persist for a very long time. If you look at herbaria, for example, herbaria have this tremendously long kind of trajectory of records because they've been around for so long, they've been generating data for so long. So this is a really nice way of picturing the different kind of shapes of data that are in the ALA and how they behave over time. Another fun one from this story, and I'm skipping over a couple here. We looked at a bunch of observations around gangangs. I'm based in Canberra. Gangangs are cool and iconic Canberra bird, and they're species that people kind of love, of course, like a lot of bird species. So in this case, what we did was looked at the process of observation and the way that people record notes or comments with their observations. So this thing is basically a word cloud, and it's a way of navigating the content of the comments that people are posting. So if we click on eating, for example, here we're seeing a bunch of comments which are related to what the gangangs are eating. They contain the word eating. So if you want to kind of dive into the kind of gang stories, you can investigate them here. But the word cloud also basically shows you a bit of a summary of what kinds of things are involved. So you might notice that there's a term here, hawthorn, which is like a food source. So a lot of gangs eating on hawthorn berries. So you can start to see relationships between this species and other species as well. You can also learn a little bit about their behavior. Like, there's a lot of stuff about pairs because gangs do tend to hang out in pairs. You can look at stuff about female and male gangs and so on. So again, it's a way of kind of opening up the content of these observations. And here trying to really explore the fact that human observation, especially with citizen science, is a kind of huge, powerful engine that's generating a lot of data in the ALA. One more quick demo from the data stories. We did a whole story on kind of threatened species and the way that they appear in the ALA. This visualization was really interesting to work on. It's a matrix which shows you threatened species status categories across all the different jurisdictions, both Australia, the national jurisdiction, and then all of the state and territory areas underneath. And I guess personally, it was interesting because it was a way of discovering the kind of slightly disconnected and inconsistent ways that states and territories classify these species, but also just seeing where that distribution of species sits. Not only do we show you the numbers, but then this becomes explorable. So again, if we want to see what are the critically endangered species in New South Wales, we can select that figure and then we can investigate the species. And then of course we can actually investigate the species as well. So you can drill all the way through from a summary entry like that through to actual information about the species. So again, something that looks quite simple becomes a way to kind of open up a whole kind of section of the ALA in different ways. So that's just a little taste of what we did in the data stories as a way of kind of exploring this territory. And I'm going to hand over to Adrian now, who's going to tell us a bit about the kind of discussions that we had following these data stories and the results that we got back.
I'll just stop you there, Adrian, because I think you're still muted.
Okay, good. Is that all right now?
Yeah, much better.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mitchell. I did unmute a minute ago, but it somehow muted me again. Hello, everyone. And I'm calling from my shed. So just to show that even as a sociologist, I'm interested in hands-on stuff. And these data stories were kind of attempts to be quite hands-on with ALA interfaces and data. So we spent a reasonable amount of time working with individuals and some focus groups, kind of guiding them through the stories, or allowing them to move through the stories, but guiding them at certain points. And as Mitchell has already indicated, the stories combine familiar kind of data interface elements, but try to do it in slightly experimental ways to provoke different kinds of perceptions of relationships or different senses of like continent-wide patterns, or many different things actually in the stories. Too many to report. The first thing was when we assembled these, people to kind of work with these experimental devices, there is a huge variety of people interested in engaging with the ALA, and that presents tremendous kind of potential, but also just a huge range of propensities and habits and skills. So, just the highlighted text on this slide is pointing out you've got some people who not even sure they should be in the focus group. They're interested in frogwatch, and they've just started making some observations. At the other end, you've got people who are working with as consultant ecologists and working with landholders and helping them plan for various environmental kind of concerns or problems, and they're quite skilled in using ALA, particularly in the area in which they work. Go to the next slide, please, Mitchell. There's no way I can kind of go through all the things that happen in those interviews and focus groups. So I just want to highlight maybe 3 threads of things that came up. Firstly, almost everyone encountered the sheer heterogeneity of ALA's holdings. and Mitchell's already shown some of those variations, but that constantly came up in different ways. You know, the way in which the ALA is using disparate data sources and bringing them together means that there are many kind of differences in the texture of the data. It's not a homogeneous kind of data form like, I don't know, Twitter posts might be. It holds lots of variations, and sometimes things are present, such as images, but sometimes they're not. So participants often kind of remarked on that. Sometimes they found the provenance of the data like surprising because a fairly recent data source such as Canberra's Nature Mapper, it's only a decade old or so, had data going back much earlier, and that was puzzling. Sometimes they got caught up in kind of the ways in which the names of things in ALA data can either have multiple meanings or don't have expected meanings. That quote there, someone trying to look at grasses and grasslands kept on encountering insects when they tried to pull up stuff on grass, and instead they got grass moths, I think, of some kind, and kept on going through it saying flies, moths, more flies, and thinking there should be grass, but there wasn't. So the ways in which data is named and has to be named doesn't always allow people to kind of move smoothly or directly to what they're interested in. And sometimes people had specific knowledges of areas, and the great theme running through almost everything we did with the various participants was that many of them kind of begin and in some cases end with their interest is like focused on very specific places, and their attachment or their connection to particular places shapes what they try to do with the ALA. And sometimes they know quite a lot already and expect to see things in the data but can't find them. And like very interesting discussions come out of that. Why is something not present in the way they think it is? Or why is something overly present or is more present than they think it should be? Second thematic concern that comes up is whenever issues of governance, particularly around conservation management, government management programs comes up, there's usually a kind of spike of interest whenever that's somehow in the data stories. And the visualization that Mitchell showed earlier, which is comparing threatened species status across jurisdictions, was like whole discussions took place around that. And in some of the focus groups that just kind of rolled on as people talked to each other about what was going on here and trying to understand the differences in the statuses, the threatened status across different jurisdictions. That, you know, this peculiarity of the Australian state federal system is kind of runs across the data and affects not only the data that's there, but the values associated to things like threatened status there. And then obviously the other big concern, which, you know, overshadows most people's encounter with these data stories, is their experience of change around biodiversity. And this came up in lots of ways, but sometimes it came up in just very kind of elementary ways when they'd find something listed in a table or a list, or they'd click it on a map and there'd be no image for it. And they'd see, oh, that's critically endangered, or it has a highly threatened status, and think, well, okay, maybe there's not many images of that. We don't have an image of that. So those kind of, that sense of the changing kind of levels of biodiversity in various places is very much kind of present in the stories. The next one, please, Mitchell. So I just want to highlight, because it will help you understand what we did next, the main themes. They're actually often kind of tensions that we kind of saw coming up in the data stories and the ways that people interacted with them. Firstly, the diversity of data in the ALA is just, I think it affects many aspects of what people are encountering when they come to the ALA. And there's no way to kind of remove that or reduce it in a way. It's a kind of, it's an irreducible component of the way in which the ALA is an aggregator of data sets, and biodiversity science itself relies on that aggregation. But the flip side of that is that there is quite a diversity of data habits. And even at a almost like the micro practices of working with data, people have quite different habits around things like lists and maps, what they expect to be clickable or what they expect to be sortable or what they expect to be able to pinch or swipe or touch. People bring very different sets of embodied kind of habits to that. And the data stories were constantly trying to permit people to do as many things as possible given the specific materials we were working with. But it was impossible to anticipate everything that people might want to do. So that's a challenge, an ongoing challenge. Second thing is this, compared to scientists and perhaps conservation managers and other kind of experts, who kind of move around and are used to kind of being in different places and have their methods for making sense of those places. Many of the participants were coming to the ALA with kind of some knowledge and awareness of specific place, and everything they did kind of departed from what they already knew about that place. And that's a complex issue. Sometimes they have very strong desires to know more about the place, and they have attachments to place. They're literally doing caring work. They belong, they have belonging, sense of belonging in that place. They have concerns about that place. At other times, there's a kind of anesthesia, or what I think of as kind of relational anesthesia. They're kind of not really aware of much about the place, even a place they're interested in, apart from some very kind of well-known species that are highly imaged and constantly being observed in the citizen science apps. The final thing here is what I think of as the compositional tension. So when we approached the ALA, we didn't think of like another citizen science app as a place where observations are recorded and you can see who has recorded or seen things you're interested in that place. We saw it as a place, ALA as a place in which, because of all the things it brings together, it might be possible to engender kind of new perceptions of relationality. The tension there is that we want to work with familiar elements, familiar visual and interface elements such as maps, lists and tables. But on the other hand, we had this kind of desire to give people a sense, maybe just an incipient kind of sense of the relationality in this data, of how that kind of compositional side of ecology works, rather than getting to focus more in a very intense kind of spotlight way on a specific species, to see things more in relation. If you see something there, what else is there associated with that? And that could range across the taxa. So those kind of things informed what we did next.
Thanks, Adrian. Yeah, so I'm going to start the demo part. So we made this thing, a new interface, a new way of exploring the ALA. We call it the lens interface because it's a kind of new way of looking at the ALA. And yeah, it tries to bring together all the ideas that Adrian just set out for you, and these ideas of generous interfaces as well. And yeah, so it's really an experiment in some new ways of looking at the ALA. So I'll give you a quick tour of it now. And as I said, I'm keen to leave time for questions. So if you have specific kind of queries or requests, we can have a chat later on. So I guess the first thing that you'll see is a map, and it's a normal web map, and you can see a big area marked out with these with this density map, this hex density map inside it. And you'll also see that there are some map markers. Now, those map markers are what I think of as a sample. So that's actually just like the latest 100 observations or occurrences that are recorded in that spatial area. And you can see those markers correspond to these tiles down the bottom. So this is just a sort of a sampling of the latest 100 observations that correspond to that area. And I've used the use my location button, which is up here. So I'm currently in Canberra. So this is looking at an area around Canberra. But you can zoom and pan this map in any way that you like. And so if we want to travel to the south coast of New South Wales, for example, then we could have a look down here and we could set up an area in that region just as well as in Canberra. So it's a map-based explorer. The density map, now this, if you're an ALA user, you might be looking at this and thinking, hey, this seems pretty familiar. This is a lot like Explore Your Area. And it is a little bit. So I'm a big fan of Explore Your Area because for me, it connects with place in a way that is quite kind of rich and promising. But this is doing a few things differently. So one thing is, just to maybe talk about the map for a sec, is we're using this density map. So one thing that we were able to do really quickly, and which was great with assistance from the ALA tech team, was to develop a new way of showing information on the map using this hex grid for density. So basically what that means is that even in this area on the south coast, there are 45,000 or so observations. That's more than you can really see in any one time, but the hex map, the density map, lets us see that volume quite easily, and we can see where there's more observations and where there's fewer. And that's an improvement over the current approach, which just uses dots in the ALA. So that's a really powerful way of showing a lot of stuff, because one attribute of biodiversity data is there's a lot of it. So if I look at a big area like this, now we're talking about nearly 6 million occurrences, and yet the map can accommodate all of them in that density, and we get an impression of where those kind of hotspots are located. So the hex map was a really key thing in kind of unlocking the way that we could show information spatially on the map. And the other thing, as I said, is the samples and the markers. And I guess my interest here and our interest here was in how do we kind of surface as much richness in those observations as possible, and also wanting to really emphasize that the currency of the data, the fact that this data is coming in all the time. Today's the 12th of November. This first observation here is from just 2 days ago. So coming in through INAT, beautiful bit of macro photography there. The other thing, as I just demoed to you, is that with these observations, if they have an image, then you are one click away from seeing the image. So you can actually see images big and see them big quickly, which for me is a really important part of kind of enriching the kind of sensory experience and the visual experience of looking at this data. And so I find it's quite nice just to kind of browse through and discover all the critters that are being noticed in a particular area. With these observations as well, there's quite a lot of information that is linked there. So for example, there's a link there that you can follow to the actual observation. So that actually shows you the occurrence in the ALA, in the normal ALA website. We can also learn more about the particular data resource, in this case, INAT. We can also focus on the species. And so, for example, if we discover a species we're interested in and we want to see or learn more about them, I can focus on that species. And so now we're just looking at tawny frogmouths in this particular area. And if I open up my spatial area, we're still looking at tawny frogmouths. And if I can go even wider, and then I can, let's look at them over a really large area. And so now we're focused on a species, and we can get to know the kind of wonderfully wacky looking tawny frogmouths. So yeah, so again, this is this generous interfaces principle of showing relationships and enabling connections and enabling exploration, where we can move from an area to a species and then stay with the species and change the area. So we can kind of walk or browse our way through the data in a way that is, yeah, I think quite sort of fluid. The other thing that you might notice here is that the markers, I'll just switch back. The markers that we're looking at in this map have little icons, and those icons relate to the taxa of those observations. So one thing that we talked and thought a lot about was, how do we actually describe the diversity of living things that are in the ALA? And how do we make that huge diversity accessible and familiar for people who are not experts, who are not taxonomists? And so as we move down, you'll see there's this categorization that we have that we are calling life forms. They're a lot like the species groups that ALA uses in other instances, but they are simplified and a kind of an aggregated list. And we're trying to use names that are simple and clear, and also make groupings that are kind of relevant and relatable. And the icons give you a way to connect with those visually. So we're looking at all life forms at the moment. If we want to just look at insects, then we can look at insects. If we want to look at reptiles, we can look at reptiles, and so on and so on. So it gives you a way of browsing through the taxa in the area that you're investigating really readily, and it affects everything else in the interface. So those filters are kind of global in that way. So now we're looking at all of the recent reptile observations in this area, and we can easily move through all of the different kind of species groups. So that's the map and the markers and the tiles. That should give you an impression as to what's happening there. And in this what we call the species view, there are two views, and I'll get to the other one in a sec. But in this species view, you'll come to this next section, which is where there are these three kind of bubbles, and these are the kind of almost like the visual signature, I guess, of the lens interface. And one thing that really came out from our research is that people are really interested in species and in specific species, but equally that it's really clear from the ALA that there's a difference between species that occur frequently, in other words, species where there's a lot of observations, and the species that are particularly connected to place, or that are that have conservation status, or are interesting or important in other kinds of ways. And so these three bubbles give you these three different views of the species in the data that we're looking at. The one on the left is common species, so it's pretty straightforward. It's just giving you a view of the 10 most frequently occurring species that are in the current data set. So again, we're looking at this 5.9 million occurrences from a big area around Canberra. You might also notice something pretty striking about what those species are in this case. Every single one of those most commonly observed species is a bird. If you know the ALA, you will also know that the ALA has mountains and mountains of bird data. And so birds tend to kind of outrank everything else if we're just looking at lists of the most frequently occurring things. Now that's cool in some ways. It's great that we have so many observations of crimson rosellas, but it does mean that some other things are not kind of visible in a way because of that. And so that then brings us to this second bubble, the distinctive species. These are species which are found more often in this area. And this is a different way of viewing species in relation to place. And I think it's probably one of the most interesting kind of features of what we've made. To explain it very briefly, essentially what it's doing is saying, what are the species that are more frequent here by comparison with the whole of the ALA? So the ones that are in this area ranked more highly or more frequently occurring compared to how they occur globally. And what that means is that you tend to get things that are more associated with place. So in this case, we've got some things like gangangs, which, as I said, are kind of iconic Canberra animals, and they are associated with the kind of biomes that we have around here. But you've also got spotted marsh frogs, superb parrots, Latham snipe, which is a wetland bird, which people love to go and spot that at places like Jerrabomberra wetlands, which is a really important wetland area in Canberra. Some more frogs, but also some weedy species like St. John's wort. So that might be something that's being observed by like land care groups. But again, it's something that's particularly linked to this area. And so the idea of these is that they give you ways of kind of discovering or encountering species that you maybe haven't heard of, or that are particularly related to the place that you're investigating. And these are clickable, and you can then go and investigate them. So if we want to see Latham snipes, for example, then we can focus on the Latham snipe, and then we can discover, go back to the map and have a look, okay, where are the Latham snipe actually appearing? And we can have a look at some pictures of them and so on. So that's distinctive species. And these are also responsive to the life form filters. So if we want to say, okay, well, actually just show me, I just want to see distinctive plants, you can really discover some interesting stuff pretty readily. Or I might say, please, I just want to see distinctive reptiles. You'll also notice, for example, in the distinctive species, some of these are actually have conservation status, or they're threatened species. And that's kind of not surprising, because if they're species that are frequent in a local area, more frequent than they are globally, they're more likely to be associated with that area. In other words, they're more likely to be endemic to that area. and have a narrow range, and so they are more likely to be threatened or endangered as well. So then the third of these bubbles is just focusing on threatened species. So this is basically looking at species that have a national conservation status, and looking at the most frequently occurring species in this area. So again, it's a way to kind of encounter species that again, you may not have encountered otherwise, some of which again are very kind of, they might be like locally well known, but not so known more widely. So there's a bunch of different sort of species that arise there. Finally, down the bottom, as a kind of concession, there is a search box. And so if you do actually want to investigate species, you can search and you get a nice autocomplete and you can investigate species in that way. So if there's something that you particularly care about and you know is going to be there, you know its name, then you can use search as well and focus on the species that way. So that's the kind of species view, which is, yeah, focusing on investigating observations and discovering species. There's also this data view, explore data facets, which reveals some of the other kind of patterns that Adrian was talking about just before. So again, just to go back to the map, here we are looking at this big area. I might just refine that area so that we get a slightly smaller set. So here we're looking at around 26,000 observations, and this data view shows us these facets, which give us these different dimensions of the data. And again, we've got the life forms over here. We've got also data resources, and we've also got conservation status. And then along the bottom, we've got the decades. So you can explore this data through time as well. Now, collectively, that gives you a really powerful set of filters for sort of investigating the data and the relationships within the data. So one thing that we noticed, for example, is that, you know, things like data resources can actually show you some of that heterogeneity that Adrian was talking about, some of the mixed kind of quality of the ALA data. So, for example, you might, if we have a look at a particular data resource, so New South Wales Bionet, which has a lot of government reported data, you can see that there's a certain distribution of species there. So there's lots of plants, some birds, quite a lot of mammals, for example. But compared obviously to something different, like, I don't know, eBird, you'll see a really different. So obviously eBird is all birds. Then iNaturalist will have a different distribution again. You know, so there's a few more fungi, for example. So in other words, there's relationships between data resources and particular taxa. There's also relationships between conservation status and taxa, and you can explore any way you like. So in this case, we might start with, let's have a look at vulnerable species, or let's have a look at vulnerable mammals. So again, this might be a way of discovering species. And here we, of course, discover that, well, number one vulnerable mammal in this South Coast forest is the yellow-bellied glider, but there's also flying foxes, and other species there as well. So just by faceting down to a particular area of focus, you can discover species that way. We might also look at endangered species, and here we find the greater glider, for example. And then we might say, oh, well, show me endangered birds, lots of gangangs, or endangered plants. So again, it's a way of really quickly being able to kind of drill in and find little pockets in the data that you maybe otherwise wouldn't have encountered, but just to make that process as sort of fast and seamless as possible. So yeah, there are a lot of different ways that these facets open up that enable you to explore these relationships between these different dimensions of the data, and make new discoveries at the same time. So that is the lens interface. Like I said, it's a new way of exploring the ALA. It makes some kind of new innovations. It tries to tackle a few gnarly challenges. The challenge of how do we pack all of the wildness of biodiversity into a set of categories that have simple names, was one of our big ones, for example. But yeah, it also provides hopefully some really fun and accessible ways of diving into the kind of richness that is in the ALA. I'm going to leave it there for now. And yeah, maybe Martin has some questions to start us off, or maybe we can just go straight into the Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Mitchell and Adrian. That's really fantastic. And I think we're going to have to start with the tool, because there's a lot of people asking very specific questions and really interested and engaged with this. So maybe if we start specific and then go more general.
Yeah, great.
One really good question, which I haven't thought of myself, was about does it work for marine taxa?
Oh yeah, it does.
The ocean to get some data.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go fishing. So it's the whole ALA corpus. So it's using the ALA's standard data set as its backend. It's just using the API. So anything that is in the API will be in this as well. And so yeah, for example, if we want to have a look at fish species in this area, then we've got some. But we might also want to look at invertebrates, for example, of which there are plenty. Yeah.
Yeah, nice. And we did have some questions about the life forms there. So people were interested in saying, oh, different types of plants, say grasses or trees or shrubs or things.
Yep.
And someone asked if we could do, more than one of those buttons at once. Now, do you want to talk a little bit about the choices you made there?
Yeah, look, yeah, this was like anything is possible, but at the same time, we can't do everything with this one interface. And so I guess a lot of the time we had to make a call about, okay, so for something like an advanced search where you might want to say, oh, I do want to see, frogs and reptiles, or I do want to see, just this particular like family or this particular, taxonomic group, then the ALA has a fantastic interface for that already. So it lets you make really sophisticated queries. And so if you know exactly what you're looking for, I think in a way the ALA's search tools and interfaces are probably doing a really good job. But hopefully this is a way for you to, start to discover maybe what you're interested in, and then you can head over to the ALA interfaces. So I guess, the one thing is this is not intended to be a replacement interface. It's intended to be a different way that is going to suit certain users and, with certain kinds of interests, I guess.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I wondered if you would mind talking a little more about your process then, because there's an attempt here, it seems, to make something that's evocative, but it's practical, but it also uses familiar tools. Was that hard to trade those different requirements against each other?
Yeah, look, that was the job, and no, I mean it was really fascinating, and I guess we did have really interesting conversations about the life forms, and I one the species groups, I was kind of like, look, there could be 20, there could be 40, there could be 50, but actually I want to keep it under 15. In other words, I want it to be like a group which is small enough that you can see them all at a glance, and not have to kind of drill through a list. So just having to make quite hard calls like that. You might have noticed, actually, it's the group that we're looking at here. This one, worms, jellyfish, sponges, and other invertebrates. If there are any taxonomists in the call, and there probably are, their toes are probably curling, because I'm glomming together a whole bunch of stuff here, which is not properly glommed together. But I guess these are the kind of like, compromises that are probably necessary. But yeah, those were definitely, that balance was always something that we were trying to keep in mind. And look, honestly, I think, I care about this data a lot, and I continue to be kind of engaged and fascinated by it. And often I would be using my own, I'd be following my nose in a way, like I'd be kind of gauging my own interest and learning in the data, and being in a way guided by that. And so, that may explain where we landed in some cases with that balance.
We have had some questions about people asking for habitat associations. I know, Adrian, you talked about this as well, that the desire to show interconnectivity and like true ecological relationships between things. Now, that's obviously a challenge, but do you feel that there's a future there? Perhaps if data structures were richer, there'd be other stories that could be told?
Oh, I mean, I'll have a crack at that. Yeah, look, absolutely. That was I'm really interested in that. I guess one one way of thinking about that is that by focusing it on spatial, on a really tight spatial constraint. So if I, zoom in a little tighter, we might get, so if you're looking at an area which is kind of, a biome, or which covers, a small range of kind of types of habitat, one thing about distinctive species is it does at least give you a bit of a sense of kind of what's hanging out together. So, in this area, we have this group of species which are found more here than they are somewhere else. And I guess what I hope is that might start to give you kind of a flavour of like, what kind of place is this? What are the species that are most characteristic of this place? And, of course, it's not showing you ecological relationships, but it is showing you co-occurrence. It is showing you things that are kind of hanging around together. So yeah, maybe that's the start of that. But yeah, look, if we could have, like, I don't know, food web data, if we could have this thing eats this thing, that'd be great, because then you could browse from a species to the species that it eats, or the species that eat it. That would be super, super cool.
Lovely. No, thank you. So Adrian, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
The only thing I want to add was that what Mitchell was doing when he was doing that demonstration, where he was kind of showing how you can combine facets with kind of filters. Also, the discussion of the hex, the binning of the data into the hexes, was in a way all motivated by that question. But we weren't, the people we were thinking could, engage with this will not use models. They won't be used to any of the kind of ways in which ecologists are equipped to kind of discover those relationships. What they will have is this kind of what Mitchell was doing, this capacity to see something interesting and then try and find out where it is or what it's associated with. So it's a kind of like a ground up version to approaching those, like where we're trying to give people a capacity to discover this from the ground up almost through the interface. Yeah, that's what I think on that.
It was interesting in your presentation there, Adrian, where you were saying that some of the quotes you gave I thought were really quite telling of people discovering new and evocative things. And one that I wrote down was that people felt saddened by the fact that they were looking at threatened species that didn't have images, and the prospect that maybe those species may never get images before they went extinct. Were you surprised at the extent to which people this experience evoked emotional responses in people?
No. No, Martin. No, I think almost everyone there was like, maybe they wouldn't have come if they didn't have some relation to that even. So yeah, almost everyone did that in some form or other. And we had some specific devices in our stories to get them to engage with that kind of like roll calls of extinction and things like that. Sometimes which people said, no, actually that works less for me. The direct kind of roll call of things going extinct doesn't work for me as well as seeing what's threatened, like it's vulnerable or endangered. I'd rather kind of see the space in which I can act, where there's something that can be done, and perhaps it's very local, or perhaps it's to do with government action or something like that, other forms of intervention. So there's kind of a range of responses, but I do think it was like pervasive in a way, just in slightly different varieties.
And do you think then that there's a role for somewhere like ALA in motivating action? You said that people are interested in the conservation status as almost a primary question, and interested in exploring as a result of that, perhaps, or learning what they can do to help those species. It's not traditionally something ALA has been involved in. Do you think that that's a real strength of the system, Pat?
I'd be interested in what Mitchell thinks, but I just think this is one of the places where stuff is brought together in a way that is very difficult to find in other places. So I'm hoping that that's tremendously useful for biodiversity science, because it needs to have those huge aggregates to do what it needs to do. But I'm also thinking that people might be able to kind of develop perceptions. I mean, that's what I was keen to see in this project. Could you engender perceptions of the relationality that is part of that kind of ecological vision of living Australia? That's what it was aiming to do.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think like we've just changed location for it just to mix things up for us, wherever we're in the southwest now. But I guess one thing that I find personally kind of important about work like this is that like that I just met the orange-bellied frog, like that I find personally rewarding, but also the fact there's, one thing that we kept coming up against in this work was, I guess we think of the ALA as being about, non-human life forms, or these other living things that we are kind of committed to and interested in. But actually, a lot of the time, what it's showing you, it's about what humans are interested in and what they're committed to and what they are attached to and connected to. And that's actually incredibly powerful. So
Yeah.
the ALA is a meeting point. It's like where these two things overlap. It's where the humans and their interests and concerns meet all of the other species on the continent and record that and evidence that. And so much of the data is about that evidencing. It's about that searching for connection or evidencing those connections. And to me, that's incredibly profoundly important. Like that's a way to start a relationship. It's a way to start a kind of interest or a concern. And it's a way to cultivate that concern. And that, I think, is, that's probably the best that work like this can hope for. So, yeah, I think that answers your question.
Yeah.
No, lovely, thank you. Now we have one very broad question. Someone asked if, now this tool is specifically built for the ALA, but presumably the approach could be used in other contexts as well, Mitchell, is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's right. Look, all of the data that it uses is very standard data. It's spatial data, it's species data, it's observation data like images and names. So yeah, all of these approaches are very translatable. Yeah.
Lovely. No, thanks so much. Well, with that, I think that's exhausted most of the questions that I can bring out of the chat. I hope everyone who's joining us today on the channel has really enjoyed this presentation, as I have, and join us again in the new year for the next webinar. Thanks again, Mitchell and Adrian. Have a good day.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks, Martin.